you had everything from executions to, as you've outlined, sexual violence, to a full range of atrocities against civilians. Crimes against humanity were certainly committed, certainly war crimes on a massive scale, and it's worth analysing the data to see whether, in fact, any of those soldiers had genocidal intent, and you cannot, at this point, exclude that.
If you've got young ears around, you might want to turn the radio down for the next few minutes, because what we're going to talk about is an incredibly important topic, but also one that is quite difficult to listen to, because we're going to talk about Russian forces who occupied Bucha in Ukraine for just 29 days at the beginning of 2022. But they committed acts of such barbarity that the town has become synonymous with their war crimes. The town's residents were killed in their hundreds, and they were buried in mass graves. Women and children were systematically raped. Investigators have now uncovered the bodies of more than 500 civilians. Dozens more remain missing. Well, today, the Sunday Times has revealed the names of 13 Russian commanding officers who oversaw that operation. Wayne Jordash KC is president of the legal foundation Global Rights Compliance, and he's been working on this investigation and joins us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Now, clearly, we don't want to go into too much graphic detail, as, you know, it's the morning and we're on the radio, but it's also important that we understand what really happened in Bucha. Just give us a sense of what you have discovered, because I know that you've been there and you've been investigating this.
Well, my organisation has been supporting the prosecution to investigate. And what the investigations have revealed so far is, as you've just outlined, is massive commission of crimes against civilians. And it's important actually to put that into context. Russia, the Kremlin, thought that they could walk into Kiev. They sent soldiers from Belarus, and they were beaten back by the Ukrainian army and by concerned civilians. And thereafter, the violence then was ratcheted up as the Russians realized that they were not welcome and that they were going to be resisted. And so orders were given which effectively said anyone who resists in any way are to be targeted as combatants. And you can imagine the consequence of that. And to add to that, not just targeted as combatants, but you can do what you want with them. And so as a consequence of that, you had everything from executions to, as you've outlined, sexual violence, to a full range of atrocities against civilians. Crimes against humanity were certainly committed, certainly war crimes on a massive scale, and it's worth analysing the data to see whether, in fact, any of those soldiers had genocidal intent, and you cannot, at this point, exclude that.
And how difficult is it to go to Bucha now and gather evidence with a view to a war crimes trial at some point, particularly when we bear in mind that clearly Ukraine is still at war?
Well, actually, Bucha is now, thankfully, in recovery mode, and to a less concerned observer, you wouldn't know much had happened there. Ukrainians, well known now for resilience, have rebuilt much of the destruction that Russian soldiers caused. The investigations now are really at a different phase. They're at the phase of looking at what has been investigated and collected over the last 3 years, which was a lot of ground investigation. And this is the way war crimes investigations proceed. First of all, a massive collection of what actually happened on the ground, and thereafter looking to see what that means in terms of the commander's responsibility. Does the pattern of crimes on the ground reveal that the commander either ordered it, or just as likely that they knew about it, they acquiesced in it, they were aware of it, aware that their soldiers were committing these crimes and didn't take any steps to change their policy or prevent or punish those soldiers? And that's really where the investigations are now. Continuing to try to identify direct perpetrators, yes, but looking at the massive, and we're talking about hundreds of volumes of evidence have been collected over the last 3 years, and trying to work out what was the patterns, which of the commanders are responsible for this pattern on the ground. So it's less about what's going to Bucha at the moment. It's more about poring over thousands and thousands of witness statements and other types of evidence.
And as I said, the Sunday Times has revealed the names of these 13 Russian commanding officers who oversaw the operation. The names obviously are important to put out. What are the chances of any justice, anybody being brought to justice over this?
Well, in the short term, to be frank, not very high. These are commanders, and 13 is just the beginning. There are many, many, many more who have been and are being identified. And given the scale of violence in Bucha, there are very strong inferences against those commanders and the 13 that the Sunday Times has revealed. The chances of getting hold of them is the critical question, because the chances of building evidence and cases against them is very high. The chances of getting hold of them and putting them in a courtroom in the short term, as I say, is very low. However, these are, in many respects, young men. They will at some point, whether in the next decade or 2 or 3, wish to travel through Europe and through countries that have signed the Rome Statute, that's the International Criminal Court's statute. And that will mean, sorry, it's my son has just come in. Beg your pardon.
That's okay, don't worry. We understand this happens when we speak to people on the radio at this time of day. It's not a problem at all, not a problem at all.
Thank you very much. So effectively, what you're talking about is waiting, building cases, making sure they're robust, waiting until these people travel, or waiting until there's a change of regime in Russia, which does not look, let's face it, very likely in the short term. It is a waiting game. It is always a waiting game with war crimes trials. It is rare that you can get hold of these suspects at the time the crimes have been committed or immediately thereafter.
And for the people of Bucha, what does justice look like to them? What do they want to see happen?
Oh, that's a very big question, actually. And I think for the people in Bucha, it is important that the prosecution work hard to identify the culprits. However, Ukrainians, I think, as a whole, and this is massively generalizing, I would say they appear to want trials as soon as possible. On the other hand, there needs to be a proper dialogue with Ukrainian public, because I think there's a temptation for prosecutors and lawyers like myself to conclude that what victims want are trials, and sometimes victims want something very different. They want reparations, they want compensation, they want their houses rebuilt, they want truth, and I think that's a really important departure point. Truth, building cases against the suspects, making sure that there is a solid foundation for those cases, and thereafter acknowledging the suffering that these victims have gone through. And I would say Ukrainian public, in the middle of an ongoing war, are desperate for truth, and they're desperate for the war to end. And that's the first priorities. I think after that, we will need to talk to Bucha victims and Ukrainian victims as a whole to determine what justice for them looks like.
Wayne Jordash, thank you so much for talking to us this morning.